From under the Golden Dome in Charleston, this is the West Virginia Capitol Report.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of the Capitol Report. I'm Bill Laird along with co-host Dave Perry, and we have a great show lined up for you today. We're very pleased to be joined in our studio by a special guest, a good friend of ours, Mick Bates, who's a member of the West Virginia House of Delegates representing the 30th Delegate District, consisting primarily of the city of Beckley and Raleigh County. And Mick, welcome to the Capitol Report show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely.
Appreciate the invitation.
Thank you.
As we all know, certainly education reform, very dominant issue during the regular session of the legislature, and again, I guess all-consuming might be a way in which to describe that, but a lot of moving parts and really the inability to achieve a consensus during the regular session, which kind of held out the prospect of a special session that's been under consideration for some time. I guess the Senate led off with their version of the special session. The House is up next, so maybe if you could, for the benefit of our viewers, just in broad strokes, where are we? I guess that's coming up here shortly.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. Where are we is something I'd like to know, because this issue, as you know, sort of bubbled up out of nowhere. No one was talking about the need for education reform, betterment as we're now referring it to. Back in November before the election, what was promised, what was discussed was a 5% pay increase. We get down to Charleston in January, and all of a sudden there's this omnibus bill that appears in the Senate, very complex, very comprehensive, that has the pay raise as well as a whole laundry list of things. Some of them very worthy and needed, and then several quite controversial issues, including education savings accounts, charter schools, and various things that there was not a lot of consensus around. That bill was forced through the Senate and then died a pretty ugly death over in the House. The House was uninterested at that point in looking at a singular piece of legislation. They had their own proposals, and the whole thing collapsed when we had another work stoppage. So we had the local folk, now counties, upset with what was going on. They appeared in Charleston, and the bill died. So the governor called for a special session that commenced actually when the regular session finished that first night. We've been in session continually since then. We've just been in recess. So we went back to back to Charleston last month and dealt with some carryover bills. But we've really not dealt with anything education related in the House as yet. 2 weeks ago, the Senate moved a version of the omnibus bill, Part 2, Version 2, another similar proposal. There were some things that were moved, some things added, but one large bundle of legislation came across, and it's sitting on its way across the hall for us to receive when we go back on Monday. And I think it's going to get a pretty unsavory welcome when it does get there.
Well,
so,
and again, looking at some of the problems during the regular session, one seemed to be a legitimate criticism was really the failure to engage stakeholders in any kind of discussion in advance of the consideration of that legislation. That teachers and those that are certainly skilled and knowledgeable about public education in West Virginia were sort of not on the front end part as far as discussions leading into that. And as a result of that, I suppose the State Board of Education, the various caucuses within the bodies, sort of went on a listening tour, so to speak.
Yes.
A number of meetings scheduled throughout the state. I think there's been perhaps a summary report prepared as a result of those public meetings. To what extent has that move the needle one way or the other in terms of some of the things on the front end part that really need to be done in order to get to some kind of consensus?
Well, as it was reported in the media, and I believe it to be true, that Senator Rutgers said there's a difference between listening and agreeing.
Right.
So we had a listening tour. What happened is all that feedback and those comments that were that were solicited from very wide number of groups across the state didn't actually make it into the bill that came across from the Senate. Now, they were incorporated in some of the bills that were introduced by other members of the Senate. So I think there were 8 bills introduced over on the Senate side that weren't taken up, that looked at the main areas of concern with regard to education in the classroom, and those weren't taken up. What was taken up was this big bundled bill with all the additional information that was gathered, didn't seem to be considered in any great detail when that bill was put together. It passed out of the Senate with non-bipartisan, with no support from both sides of the aisle, and in fact 2 of the Republican senators voting against the bill, as they did with the original proposal. So, you know, there seems to be a minority of the folks in the majority in the Senate that feel that this is the way to go. And I think the House feels very, very differently.
Mick, I know that there's been some behind-the-scenes discussion about the special session in terms of the governor possibly rescinding his proposal for the session or his call. Where would that stand?
Yeah, now my understanding, and this is something I have looked into, is that that's not actually possible. Once the call has been made and an item's been put on that call in his proclamation, and the House and the Senate's received that, then those items cannot be removed from the agenda. And it would require an action of the House or the Senate to adjourn. So once he has made the proclamation and called us into special session, he can add things to that proclamation, but he can't take things away, and he can't dismiss us or send us home. That's really within our jurisdiction.
So that would be off the table.
That would be off the table
discussion.
at this point.
Also, of course, you're a minority chair of finance, and that's to be commendable. Mm-hmm. You know, we talked about the pay raise, and I understand that the Senate legislation for the pay raise would go into effect 2020.
Yeah, so it's been pushed back an additional year, which I think people would be very surprised to see. So now the money's actually in the budget, so the money was actually incorporated into our budget that we passed. So the money is available there, but the pay raise itself has now been delayed for an additional year, based upon the proposal. Now, I guarantee you that won't come out of the House that way. So we'll make every effort to ensure that what was promised is what's delivered.
Because you know, as you said, the money's in the budget.
Yes.
Wonder why they made it 2020.
I believe in an attempt to try to get some of these other items included. So I'm not sure what their plans are for those resources that were allocated for the pay raise.
And of course, you have the Senate that's gone into session, and you all don't go into June the 17th. Why the delay?
Well, my understanding is that there are some fairly senior people that are actually out of the country right now. So the reason the Senate went in when they did is so that the Senate President could leave on a trip to the Middle East. And my understanding is that the leadership in the House right now is on a trade mission to China and to Japan. So there's no one to fly the ship, so to speak.
Right.
So which again leads to the lack of real communication between both bodies in this whole process.
Of course, you all have a caucus, and the Republicans have a caucus. Yes. Do you get a sense that Speaker Henshaw has direction with his caucus in relation to the Senate version, or he has his own sense of what to do with the bill? Well,
what the Speaker has done is divided the whole House up into 4 committees, all to deal with educational topics. And you can look at the composition of those committees and see that they're structured in a way to make it more or less likely to receive certain kinds of bills. You know, particularly if you look at the composition of Subcommittee C and composition of Subcommittee D, you have some idea about where bills would potentially go based upon what kinds of items that they would include. He, at the times that I've spoken to him, and the general sense that I have in speaking to the members of the Republican caucuses, their primary approach or primary interest would be in dealing with issues individually, and that's the case in the Democratic caucus as well. Is that, you know, we believe these items need to stand on their own merits, be voted individually. It's constitutional. It's unconstitutional to deal with more than a singular object in a piece of legislation. In the event that this thing was to pass, I would anticipate a legal challenge to it. And it's also contrary to the rules of the House. We have a rule in the House that says, as you know, that says that a bill can only deal with a particular topic that's included within its title. You know, I think that this approach is doomed to fail irrespective of its passage in the House, and I don't see that there's a lot of love for dealing for this singular bill. So we'll see where it goes.
You know, Mick, again, process is sometimes interesting, and you know, again, when you think of a 100-member body, you know, subdividing into 4 committees that I guess a composition of which would be 25 members per committee or thereabouts. You know, I would use the term, is there a cop in the middle of the intersection?
Sure.
I mean, I can see these, you know, the tendency to isolate and hammer and beat on those issues, but at the end of the day, the fact that this, you know, is a comprehensive omnibus piece of legislation, and again, maybe one of the ongoing criticisms of that certainly in the House seems to have been, hey, this thing perhaps needs to be broken down into component parts and considered up or down based on the merits of those particular issues. Is there any potential of that?
I believe so, and I have heard that there are people actually working on that, looking at the bill and saying, okay, if we were to take this bill, how could you logically carve it into pieces that would make some sense? You know, one of the concerns I have is the fiscal requirements. I mean, you know, some of these things have a pretty good price tag to them, and you know, you have these committees that are broken up to deal with education, but will a bill come before finance? You know, we'll have an opportunity to go ahead and examine it and look at the fiscal impacts of these decisions, because they are in more cases than not, they are base building. It's not just this budget, but it's future budgets that would continue to be required to be analysed. Now, so those are some real concerns.
And again, perhaps more of a process question, but you know, pretty unusual for a bicameral legislature to meet, you know, separate and apart and not concurrently. It's sort of like a tennis match, first serve and no return volley. Is the Senate going to be in concurrent session beginning on June 17th?
My understanding is they're not.
Oh my goodness.
So that's at this point. Now, there's a very fluid situation that could very well change.
Wow.
But you saw additional comments today. Not only are the House and the Senate not on the same page, then you have Governor Justice, who has got his own feelings with regard to these things that seem to change from time to time. But there is a pretty strong level of disagreement between him and the Senate leadership at this point about how we should proceed with this particular issue. So, you know, he has the ability to be able to veto the bill too. So ultimately, whatever goes through is going to be subject to his approval or disapproval.
And of course, if he vetoed the bill, it would require 4/5 of the body to override that veto, correct?
No, my understanding is simple majority at this particular time.
Okay.
So the 4/5 would, and which is somewhat unusual, but again, we can override the veto with a simple majority of both houses. So, but you know, again, that I hope we don't get to that point. I hope that, and what should have happened, and what I believe should have occurred, is that we should not have been in special session. That we should have come together and brought in both parties, representatives of the Governor's Office, the Board of Education, and basically got in a room that was large enough that we all sit around the table and figure out what we could all agree on. And once we had an agreement, and once we had the bills in place, and once the bills were drafted adequately, then to be called back. Then to be called back and to pass this legislation in one day and have it signed and move on. But that's not the process that was undertaken.
And you know, again, at one point in time, you know, the legislature put a good bit of premium on interim meetings where the body would assemble and, you know, sometimes if you're going to eat an elephant one bite at a time, you know, work on, you know, complex policy issues, begin to develop, lay the framework, bring the experts in, and that sort of vets issues going in. And it seems as if in the last few years there's really been a conscious effort to de-emphasize what I thought was an extraordinarily valuable tool for legislators to be able to interact in an interim session before you roll out onto the big stage.
I would agree with you completely, and I think that we waste those opportunities, and we get down there in January and we're dealing with complex issues in a very short period of time, things coming in all sorts of directions, and you know, it's difficult to get up to speed on all these things at the one time. So, you know, I said about 2 months ago that betterment was better done in the fall, if not at all. and that we should have been taking several months to work through these processes, and then we could have come back perhaps just before the holidays and had a special session where we did what we talked about, which is have everything laid out and agreed upon.
Right.
You know, some people said, well, what about the pay increase? There's no reason why we couldn't have backdated that or done it as a bonus payment or some other methodology. Right. There are ways to deal with those issues, but I would agree completely that we're wasting our opportunities to be able to dig deep on in some of these complex problems and use the interim process to do that.
No doubt. Well, we're going to need to take a quick break, and we'll be back with Delegate Mick Bates from the 30th Delegate District joining us here talking about education reform in the state of West Virginia. Take a break and be right back. Stay with us, everybody.
Stay tuned. The West Virginia Capitol Report will be right back. The West Virginia Capitol Report is brought to you by the AFL-CIO of West Virginia, Cucumber & Company, online at cucumberandcompany.com, and Mark Hunt & Associates, toll free at 800-554-1280. From under the Golden Dome in Charleston, this is the West Virginia Capitol Report.
Welcome back to the Capitol Report as we continue our discussion about public education reform in the state of West Virginia. Our guest today is Delegate Mick Bates from the 30th Delegate District in Raleigh County. And Mick, in continuing our discussion about, in more broad strokes, the current education reform efforts in the West Virginia legislature, some have characterized this as perhaps a little bit of perhaps an act of retribution. Obviously, the teachers very vocal, physically present, up front and counted for during the regular session. And there were some aspects of the Senate-passed legislation really intended certainly to jeopardize the interests of teacher organizations. And again, some folks have characterized this as just merely a continuation of the majority party's attack on the interests of working families. Do you in any way see indications of that?
Well, you'd like to think not, but based upon what I refer to as the Empire Strikes Back Amendment, late on a Sunday afternoon when they attempted to codify the illegality of a work stoppage, basically to prevent the teachers and the other organisations and groups that were very vocal and really changed the conversation during this regular session, the previous regular session, from doing what they did, which is to withhold their labour. Right. So that provision was added to the bill to basically make the strike illegal, and in addition to prevent local boards of education from closing schools in anticipation of that.
And I guess that concerns me most, Delegate, because
safety,
safety is a big issue.
Yeah.
So when schools stop closing as a result of snows and so forth, what do we do about safety?
That's right. That's right. And I think that in one breath they talk about local control and flexibility, and we want to provide our boards of education with an opportunity to make decisions that are in the best interests of their county and their system and the district. And then at the same time, we'll say, well, except for the fact that if the teachers decide to go out, so we're not going to let you do that. So it just certainly does seem hypocritical to take that process. And what happened? Sorry,
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mick.
I was just saying that what happened here in West Virginia did strike a national movement. You've seen education becoming a very topical and a very proactive issue across the country as a result of what happened here in West Virginia, and that's upset some people. And I will tell you that. That provision certainly does look to me as if it's directly aimed at those organisations and those unions, the public sector, organised labour, and an attack on them and their organisations.
Absolutely.
There appears to be a very definitive philosophical difference between the House and Senate that basically hasn't existed before. What do you think that is, or why do you think that's come to pass?
I think the bodies themselves are constructed differently in terms of how we represent the people that vote for us. We run every 2 years. We're in generally smaller districts. We tend to be a little bit closer to the people that we represent. So we hear from them on a regular and consistent basis. With no disrespect, the members of the Senate are responsible for a much larger area by the nature of that. They tend to be a little bit further away from the people they represent and can take positions on things that perhaps aren't as popular in the grocery store. So, you know, this is a proposal that was been put forward by the Senate leadership. This is Senate President Carmichael. This is Education Chair Rutger. It's coming out of the Eastern Panhandle. If you look at it, that's where it's Craig Blair, the Finance Chair in the Senate. Whereas in the House, you've got people that represent very varied constituents in very varied districts and are close to the people that they represent.
I guess the other thing, it seems what's gotten lost is the primary discussion has been around charter schools in essence.
Yes.
But there are other parts of this bill and there are other parts with single bills. Could you kind of go over some of those for our audience?
Well, I
let
think
us know what else is contained in that would probably be individual bills, Mick.
Yes, and that's, again, I think that's part of the danger we run, is we could end up with nothing if we're not careful. And there are some good things within this bill. And again, education is not the public policy area that I'm the most experienced in, but financially I know that the bill includes issues that help smaller counties, that freeze their enrollment below a certain amount, so it makes sure that their enrollment drops below 1,400. I'm sorry, 1,400,
right.
Then they continue to receive that base level allocation. It also helps the growth counties, those counties that are doing well. It limits their reductions in their funding because of the increase in their local share. It provides additional money to go back into the counties to enable them to provide wraparound services, counsellors, social workers, to be in the classroom and in the schools so that teachers can teach. And there are people there to be able to help with the various problems that children face nowadays that we and probably didn't face when we were in school. I've always said that our schools are a reflection of our communities, and many of our communities are struggling. Many of our communities have real problems, and the kids, I mean, they don't leave those problems at home when they get on the bus. They get on the bus with the kid, they come to school, and teachers are required and forced to deal with them. Right. So those are just some of the things within the bill that I think are positive that we run the risk of losing if we take this approach.
And you're exactly right. You know, community schools are an extension of the community, and in areas where you have you know, raging substance abuse and addiction problems, you know, those are things that kids have to deal with. And again, I think some of the aspects of this bill perhaps look to probably strengthen the, you know, counseling components. Yes. I've heard the term wraparound services using. It's more or less, I guess, sort of a holistic recognition of the fact that it's not just what happens behind a podium in a classroom that impacts and affects the education of children. It occurs within the context of the community.
Yes, yes.
And that's
there are elements of the bill that do address those things. There are also elements of the bill that provide some additional resources for our teachers, increases the amount of money that's available for them for things like classroom supplies, provides some flexibility in terms of pay in some areas where they're having trouble attracting certain teachers, either geographically or in subject matter experts. So there are a number of things that are there that I think that we'll do. There are about 30 bills that will be introduced on the House side directly. I've got I've got two bills that I'm interested in seeing considered during that process. But you know, it'll all be determined by where these bills get referred to when we reconvene on the 17th.
Absolutely. Mick, you know, I'm always concerned in, you know, hotly debated matters of public policy. You always have to consider, are there potentials for collateral consequences? And I read a letter to the editor over the weekend that kind of bothered me a little bit. It was basically an obviously competent, qualified teacher who just said, hey, I've had enough, I'm out of here. And you know, we have at best problems with you know, recruiting and retaining competent, qualified teachers, and indeed there are those us who believe that that's sort of where education starts, is having a good quality teacher attracted to the profession, staying with the profession. Could perhaps one of the inadvertent, perhaps unintended collateral consequences of this very sometimes heated debate to be viewed as somewhat demeaning to the profession, and in fact make it more difficult to have qualified teachers?
Very much so, and really it's a question of respect, and that's what's really driven this whole process, or the lack thereof it. And very interesting, I've met with a series of, with a group of students, and I asked all of the people in this room, it was at Woodrow Wilson High School, I said, who here is considering going into the teaching profession? And not one. Not one of those students said, and when I dug it a bit deeper, it was because of that issue. They don't feel respected, and they don't feel it's a profession that's respected to the level that that's something that they want to do. That's a real concern. That's a real concern.
Wow.
So,
Interesting statement you made a few minutes ago about the closeness of the delegates and so forth. And of course, Bill mentioned a few minutes ago about redistricting.
yes.
Let's switch gears and talk a little very quickly about redistricting and what the public can look forward to that.
Yeah, so but basically every 10 years we redraw the lines based upon what the census does, and that we went through that, and that's really what led to my decision to actually run for office in the first time, is the fact that I believe those lines were drawn in an inappropriate way in Raleigh County, the people that I represent. But we will have 100 House districts. We will have 100 single-member House districts. We passed a bill earlier 2 years ago that did that.
Really?
That all House districts will be single-member delegate districts. Now, what shape they form and what way they're drawn will be done by a non-independent commission, as was originally intended, but done by the legislature themselves. So there'll be the census in 2020. That'll be done in 2021, and then 2022 we'll be voting in new districts in the House and the Senate as well. But those lines will be drawn, and it's really based upon population, and we anticipate that, unfortunately, West Virginia continues to lose population, and probably some of those people will be teachers that decide to move elsewhere. That'll determine the number of, not the number of people, but where those lines are drawn in what parts of the state.
The West Virginia Capitol Report is brought to you by the AFL-CIO of West Virginia, Cucumber and Company, online at cucumberandcompany.com, and Mark Hunt and Associates, toll free at 800-554-1280.
Welcome back to the Capitol Report as we close out today's show. And Dave Perry, Mick Bates, pretty bright guy, should be an exciting next few weeks.
Absolutely, and very enlightening with information we hadn't received before, Bill.
You know, again, something coming up starting on the 17th, important to the future of the state. Again, that's going to do it for the Capitol Report show. On behalf of co-host Dave Perry, I'm Bill Laird, thanking you all for tuning us in. Have a good week, and goodbye, everybody.
This has been the West Virginia Capitol Report.